Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to advocate and organize and educate around the eco-socialist platform that Angela Walker and I ran on. And today is Earth Day. And those of you who tried to watch this live, I apologize. We had technical problems, but it's being posted on the platforms after we do this show. So I don't know, we've done like 150 of these programs. I haven't had this problem before. I apologize. But it's unfortunate, but it's still going to be out there that our guest today, Mark Dunlea, it being Earth Day, it seemed appropriate to have one of the Green Party's OGs, original Greens, on to talk about climate and environmental problems on Earth Day. He's a graduate of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. He got a law degree. He was one of the organizers of the New York Public Interest Research Group, one of many projects he's worked on with Ralph Nader over the years. He was trained in organizing with Acorn back in the 1970s. In 1984, he was the campaign manager for the feminist activist Sonia Johnson for president on the Citizens Party ticket. And for those of you who don't remember or are too young to remember, at the time, the Citizens Party was considered the American Green Party by the German Green Party, which was the original and foremost one by people like Petra Kelly. You know, we ran Barry Commoner, America's foremost environmental scientist, who ran on what we could call today an eco-socialist Green New Deal in 1980. So coincidentally, but not intentionally, the first national organizing meeting of the Green Party was a mile or two away from the last convention of the Citizens Party in St. Paul, Minnesota in August 1984. And a few of us walked a mile or two down the road to that convention on Saturday night that weekend to see what was going on. And, you know, nothing formal came out of that, but as the Citizens Party faded away, the Green Party grew. And many Citizens Party activists like Mark and Richard Walton of Rhode Island, who was the Citizens Party vice presidential running mate, with Sonia Johnson, came into the Green Party. And Mark later wrote a novel called Madam President about the first female president, which seemed more modeled on Medea Benjamin than Sonia Johnson. But that's a book to look up if you're looking for a good read. In any case, Mark became the driving force behind the establishment of the Green Party in New York. I think that was in 1990. And he's been my campaign manager or senior advisor on my statewide campaigns, U.S. Senate against Hillary Clinton, and 3 times against Andrew Cuomo for New York governor. And for decades, Mark's day job was being the executive director of a major anti-poverty group in New York, the Hunger Action Network of New York State. But in recent years, he got out of that and has been focused pretty much full time on the climate emergency. And he has a nonprofit called the Green Education and Legal Fund. We'll get the link to that in the chat, through which he's doing a lot of that work. There's a lot of good information on that website. He teaches a course on climate at Bennington College. And when he couldn't find a textbook adequate for the course, he decided to write his own, and it's out now. It's called Putting Out the Planetary Fire. There you see it, An Introduction to Climate Change and Advocacy. And you can read it online at the Green Education and Legal Fund website. And what's unique about it is it doesn't just describe the problem. It talks about how to organize and advocate for the changes we need. So it's unique in that respect, and it's a good primer on the whole issue. And Mark is also the co-chair of the National Green Party's EcoAction Committee. So thank you, Mark, for being here. And, why don't you start off by just telling us what you think we should know and be doing about the climate emergency and environmental problems in general?
Well, I was going to note that you seem to have left out your 1998 campaign for state controller, which I also helped organize, which got the Green Party ballot status for the first time in New York. We had Al Lewis, some people know him as from Grandpa Munster and other TV, as our lead candidate. Time is running out. And in our 2010 campaign, where I was your actual manager in that one, when you're running for governor, you were the first one to launch the call for a United States Green New Deal, and that combined a 10-year timeline to transition to zero emissions in terms of greenhouse gases, to halt new fossil fuels, particularly the fracking of natural gas, which was a major issue at that point in New York. We successfully, a number of years later, defeated that, and combine that with an economic bill of rights, as you said, based on what FDR said in his last State of the Union address, the right um, to healthcare, single payer healthcare, right to living wage job, guaranteed income, housing, and education. And unfortunately, 14, 13 years later, that is still essential. And recently the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to be honest, somewhat conservative in terms of their estimations of the problem of climate change. Most of their predictions have turned out to have been too slow or too weak in terms of how bad the problem is, but they're considered the gold standard, by political and business leaders. They came out once again just last month and said we're at a time that the pledges that governments at all levels have made since Paris in what was that 2015 or so are totally inadequate to keep climate warming below what we have agreed now is the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Beyond that, you begin to experience not only increase in extreme weather, but the possibility of actual climate collapse, climate chaos, millions, hundreds of millions possibly of refugees. And they predict actually that at the present rate, probably by mid to 2030 decade, we'll have gone past that 1.5 degree target. And so we have to stop burning fossil fuels. That's the simplest thing to be done. That's not a message that Democrats are willing to do. Even when Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez appropriated Howie's Green New Deal without attribution, she dropped out many of the progressive elements that was in our Green New Deal, starting with opposition or a halt to new fossil fuels. So even the progressive wings of the Democrats have been generally fairly bad at really standing up to the fossil fuel industry. We saw that just recently in New York after the much ballyhooed, state climate law that was passed here in New York. They called the strongest in the country. It took them 4 years to even come up with beginnings of a plan. And then once the new governor, because the old one had to resign due to sexual harassment, actually began to read the document, he said, well, wait a minute. We start charging fossil fuel companies for the pollution they're creating. That's going to drive up the price at the pump, and they'll blame me as a governor. So let's weaken the already weak deals. So we have to move fast. We have to stop, all new, fossil fuel problems. And I think also one of the things, particularly was what the green needs to do, and Howie's certainly been doing this quite a bit. We have to say no to capitalism. And it's sort of ironic in a certain extent that Pope Francis was very clear in his climate encyclical when he first, was elevated to Pope, that the mentality that drives the rich to exploit the poor is the same mentality that drives majorities to exploit, people of color. It's the same one that allow human beings to exploit the environment, and that we have to create a different type of world, a world based on common good, world based on sustainability, a world based on a concept of true democracy, and not this world where capitalism, which seeks both perpetual growth, but also believes that how you allocate resources best in the economy is by running to maximize profit. They believe that's the most efficient way to organize the economy. And the problem is that has led to runaway global warming. Even the IPCC, which officially is the spokesperson for the United Nations. That's one of the reasons why its pronouncements are, in fact, quite a bit weaker than the actual science, because the United States, Russia, Brazil, Saudi Arabia have to sign off on the executive summary that's put out by the IPCC. But they've also made very clear that the capitalist system based on continual growth um, cannot solve the climate crisis. And I do think the climate movement needs to be a lot clearer about that. Talk about the issue of eco-socialism, democratic control certainly over the energy system, democratic control, public ownership of the energy system, but also largely much more democratic control over the economy in general. Today, of course, is Earth Day. One of the things that EcoAction and the Green Party over the decades has highlighted is that we need to connect Earth Day to May Day because the issues are interconnected. That we need to stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, those fighting for gender equality, GL or LGBTQ, economic justice, that none of us are going to win unless we all win, and that we need to make more common cause. So we promote things here on Earth Day, but we also want to be standing with our brothers and sisters in the labor movement, and also increasingly May Day has been with the immigrant rights movement, and linked together. I mean, it has to be as the Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Everywhere was talking about. It has to be the 99% rather than the 1%, which is sort of focused upon. I understand in Illinois, who's hosting this partially this production, very concerned about the issue of divestment, trying to get the various public entities, public pension funds, college endowments, faith-based endowments to stop funding fossil fuels. It, it's against a lot of our moral grounds to continue to invest in companies that are literally destroying life on the planet in order to get allegedly an extra 1 or 2% rate of return on your pension. But also in reality, over the last decade, the fossil fuel companies have been the worst performing part of Wall Street. So it's actually been a very bad divestment or bad investment. When we did a study a couple of years ago looking at what would have happened 10 years ago if the New York State pension fund had divested from fossil fuels, actually it would have been worth an extra $22 billion. We have been successful, a lot of that through my work with 350 NYC, part of 350.org, but we did get both the New York City and the New York State public pension funds to divest from fossil fuels. They are the second and third largest public pension plans in the country. We're still unfortunately having to work, been doing this for 10 years now, trying to convince the New York State teachers retirement system. But a lot of people that are involved in the divestment movement, and that was a conscious effort to replicate what had taken place in South Africa as a way for divestment to have helped to drive the fight against apartheid. That is what we consciously did with the divestment from fossil fuels. It also was a great organizer too. After 350 nationally announced they were going to launch this divestment campaign, and not so much the public pensions. I was attracted to that because of my longtime involvement with the state legislature as an anti-hunger advocate, knew how it worked, but mainly to really go after a lot of the faith-based institutions and colleges. And literally overnight, there were like close to 200 individual campaigns that were launched. So it was a great organizing too. And a lot of people who came out of the divestment movement on the college campuses were the ones who, when they graduated, then launched the Sunrise Movement. And Bill McKibben, who was one of the founders, activist, author of 350, has now set up the third act, um, for some reason he felt there weren't enough senior citizens involved in the climate movement. I kind of sometimes mention to Bill, maybe you should stand a little further back in the crowd off the stage if you can't see the senior citizens, who are usually the biggest part of the crowd. But we try to stay in the back, get the TV cameras on, a little bit more diversity. But they just did a nationwide protest at the four big banks in New York. I'm sorry, four big banks in the United States: Wells Fargo, Citibank, um, and two others, Chase Bank and Bank of America. They're the biggest funders at the world level, and their investment in in fossil fuels has sort of increased, um, since Paris. The book, is how he mentioned putting out the planetary fires. Does talk about various actions one can take. One of the things I turned 65 a couple of years ago, and I decided to get arrested 3 times doing civil disobedience at Wall Street down in New York City, at blockading a power plant being built on the Connecticut New York border, and then one at the state capitol. I think we have to start putting our bodies on the line. I think we may also have to consider moving from symbolic protest, where you try to get arrested, to actual blockades. Actually, what we did at Cricket Valley in New York was we shut down a plant that was being built, for a day. But other people have actually literally crawled into pipelines and handcuffed themselves in order to stop the construction of the pipelines. We have to say no. Um, I could ramble on for a long time, but we're going to try to get into some questions. A couple of things, how we did want to make sure I mentioned, what can people do locally. You also wanted me to mention, a bit about plastics. I also mentioned, one of the people who put their name on my book was Medea Benjamin of Code Pink. And one of the things that when we did the original Green New Deal back in 2010, we said, well, one of the ways you can fund the Green New Deal, besides taxing the polluters, is slash the military budget by at least 50%. Probably, I think Howie and I would be closer to 75%, if not more. You look at how bad the train system is in the United States, virtually no fast trains, and our fast trains are considered slow by European standards. Well, if we were putting money into our train system, or into affordable housing, or into schools, or into water and sewer systems, our country would be a lot stronger. And so that's one way, by cutting the military budget. And it's not only just cutting the military budget; it's actually ending the whole concept of imperialism, and that we become the bully of the planet in order to make it easier for American multinational companies to exploit people all across the planet. And then the other issue that Howie wanted me to make sure I mentioned was the issue of plastics. My wife um, is head of a group called Beyond Plastics, is trying to end single-use plastics. It's a tremendous litter problem. It's a tremendous climate problem. More and more, the materials that are used to produce plastics are from the fossil fuel industry, including fracking waste. And as the world has risen up to say to the fossil fuel companies, listen, it's time for you guys, to end, they are rapidly, transitioning over, to plastic as a new market for them to conquer. And in fact, all these ethane plants are building to process the plastic, of the fossil fuels, is rapidly beginning to exceed the carbon emissions from coal. The Green Party in Brooklyn, where I was living at that point, held the first meeting in New York, big mass meeting in New York City, to launch the call to ban plastic bags, which we eventually were successful after about 6-7 years, how to do it at the state level. We've been doing other things like trying to, uh, when you go to fast food restaurant, that they don't hand you a straw with your can of soda. something like $5 billion. No, I'm sorry, 5 billion plastic straws are handed out a day, and about 99% of them are immediately, turned into waste, and it's become one of the biggest source of litter. Another law that we've been working, I think New York City just did pass it, was to stop utensils, plastic utensils. You do a takeout order, and the guy drives the bike, give him a tip, and he sometimes it's she, hands you a bag, and it has all this plastic utensils in it. You're just going to discard because you're home. So make that, as well as plastics in the store, plastic straws on demand. And we can get into a whole lot of other things about plastic, but beyond plastics.org has a lot more information. One of the things, I actually tried to get the California Green Party to step in, couldn't quite pull that one off. But groups like Beyond Plastic are really pushing very hard to reduce the amount of, especially plastic packaging. And in order to try to beat the advocates, the industry, Coke, Pepsi, have put together extended producer responsibility laws, something many of us have called for decades, basically trying to make the producers both financially and physically responsible for the disposal of the waste they create. Unfortunately, what they're doing is they're using this as a way to sneak in loopholes to actually protect the industry. And a lot of environmental groups who are not experts on plastic or on waste issues have actually been supporting the bill. And California, in fact, did pass it. We have a much better bill that we hope to pass in New York. But one of the big things is that the plastic industry, and we only can recycle about 5 to 6% of plastic. You can recycle cans, you can recycle bottles, glass, metal. You really cannot recycle plastic. It was one of those urban myths, only about 5 to 6%. They're trying to go into what they call, as always, we got new technology, guys, really solves all the problems. So they're basically branding burning plastics as chemical recycling. We call it plastic incineration, and that's sort of a really big fight. What you can do locally is get active at every level, federal, state, international, and local. Certainly one of the issues the Greens have pushed for decades, public power. We should own the energy system. There's a big effort underway in New York and elsewhere at the state level we actually have a state power authority, which mainly created out of the initial New Deal, because you build a lot of hydro out there by Niagara Falls. And so they deliver it to systems across the state. And they want the state power authority to build renewables, which is a good idea, but we also have to democratize the New York Power Authority. But we have 52 municipal power systems in New York State. They should be much more active in terms of developing, renewable energy. A number of places have taken our Green New Deal. Democrats watered it down, and they kind of watered it down even further, but there's some good stuff. Unfortunately, the Green New Deal sort of gets branded now as anything that's going to create jobs on the environment, and that's good. They kind of forget the economic Bill of Rights part of it. But there's a lot of efforts around building decarbonization. I'm mainly familiar with New York. So in New York, about 19% or so of the greenhouse gas emissions come from electricity. We've actually been fairly successful, and we got a lot more to do, but we have been successful in reducing emissions coming out of the electric production industry. The two biggest sectors in New York State, each over 30%, closer to 40%, is in buildings and transportation. And so Ithaca, for instance, has a Green New Deal, basically trying to raise $100 million to help families, households decarbonize every building in the city of Ithaca, not just the publicly owned one. And that means the normal stuff like energy retrofits and insulation, which is good, but also, more energy efficient, heating systems like, air heat pumps, geothermal, a little bit more expensive up front, but actually better. Boston's going to be doing, a Green New Deal. They're trying to look at not just building decarbonization. A lot of places looking at how to overhaul their building codes. That's helpful. Once again, I know the data in New York. We build 40,000 to 50,000 new homes. Yes, a year. Yes, we should pass laws that ban gas in new buildings. New York City has passed that beginning in 2024. It's becoming more common, but there's 40,000 new buildings a year. There's 5 million existing buildings. So you also got to figure out ways to go after those, energy retrofits. Boston is going to go look at the transit system. Well, Boston has, from my understanding, it has at least some form of mass transit. We really do not need to have every household in America owning 2 electric cars. We need to build out our mass transit system, and that includes high speed buses, rapid transit buses, various forms of electric, not quite like trains, but similar to trains. you know, I want to say it'd be good to bring up the American transit system to the status of the transit system in most third world countries. But, why should I, actually slander the third world countries? Because in reality, most of them have better mass transit systems than we do. And why do we have such poor mass transit besides shipping all our money to the war profiteers, is because the automobile companies decided that let's kill mass transit in the United States in order that everybody has to buy a car. And we have to sort of reverse that. So we could go on and on and on. But Howie, do you have a question or some questions from the chat at this point? I don't know if we have any questions because of our little production problem.
Yeah, we're not going to have live questions from the chat, although let's get that other link we had in the chat to that New York Times op-ed that came out on Thursday, uh, which is about microplastics and how it's in our bodies.
Right.
And we don't really know what's going to happen with that, but it's probably not good. We already know it's really harming fish. There it is. And Judith Think, who's Mark's wife and head of Beyond Plastics, is having a letter to the editor, which will probably be published by the time you see this in the New York Times, amplifying what that editorial is about. So take a look at. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, what we got there is Judith's op-ed. There's the other one on microplastics, and then the one before that was Judith Think's op-ed on dioxin coming out of the East Palestine railroad derailment.
Right.
So
one thing I'll mention on plastic, maybe a couple of months ago, my wife, the Senate held its first, I guess, public hearing on plastics, and so they basically had my wife and then sort of scientists from our side speak, and then they had the plastic chemical industry speak. And one of the things the scientists, for some reason, all those senators, largely a lot of old white guys, kind of have about as much hair left as we did. But some of them were sort of nodding off. But when the scientists said, "Oh, and by the way, one of the things that are threatened by the fact that there's so much plastic in our bodies now is male reproductive systems," suddenly they all woke up and began paying attention. And then Judith mentions to the scientists afterwards, why don't you lead with the male reproductive system being threatened by plastics right from the start, because that way you guarantee that they're going to pay more attention. And in East Palestine, in Ohio, a couple issues there. You mentioned, well, one is the train derailment. And one of the things I point out, Barry Commoner, we mentioned earlier, 1980 Citizens Party race, one of his big issues was to, at least nationalize the railroad tracks, because for decades, these companies often will skimp on, maintenance of the railroads. When I was an organizer in Iowa in the mid 70s for Iowa Acorn, mainly I was based in Des Moines, we had derailments all the time in low income neighborhoods because they weren't maintaining the crossing properly. And, fortunately, at that point, they were mainly transporting corn in Iowa. So there wasn't that, chemical stuff. But in this case, this train that derailed was transporting vinyl chloride. which is one of the most toxic things known to science. Very bad for humans to be exposed to it. And what they did, because there were 5 tanker cars of vinyl chloride in this derailment, somebody decided to just burn those 5 tanker cars. And so this massive toxic fireball and smoke, spread out over all that community. And as we've investigated, or people investigated, who exactly made that decision? They want to, the fire chief, in this little town of a couple thousand people, he made the decision. Did the governor make the decision? Did the EPA make the decision? It literally seemed it was the governor and probably the railroad company, and they were not at all concerned about the environmental and health impact of doing a crazy thing like doing a live burn of 5 massive tanks of vinyl chloride. They wanted to reopen the train tracks, and literally like half an hour after they 5 days later declare, oh, the emergency's over with, the trains begin to roll. And I will say they are trying to do now related issue. The Railroad Workers United trying to do public ownership of the railroads. So that's a little bit more about plastics, and they're everywhere. And it's like 1 out of every 3 for every 3 pounds of fish in the sea, there's a pound of plastic now. And you go on the remote mountaintops and you test the soil, and it's plastic. It's just everywhere. And it spreads, and these things, they break down into smaller and smaller chunks, and it very bad, of course, for animals, the fish trying to eat it. They get attracted by the color. It accumulates in their body, and then we eat the fish, but we also breathe it.
Yeah, we got to replace plastics with either inert materials or biodegradable materials. One of the things we've been talking about, Barry Commoner, is a good book to read is Making Peace with the Planet. And one of the points he makes in there, as he made in previous books, is that everything we were using before, really after World War II, when we started making all these synthetic chemicals and plastics and things like that, they co-evolved in the ecological system, so that for everything that was produced by nature, by organisms, there was an enzyme that would break down that organic chemical, a protein, a carbohydrate, whatever, so that the ecological system safely recycled all the materials that was used in them. With all this synthetic material, it creates all kinds of problems. It doesn't break down. It bioaccumulates in our bodies. That affects our endocrine system, our reproductive system for males that scientists was talking about. And we got to get back to a principle that we've got to stop. This is another point Barry Commoner made a lot, is that environmental action worked when we banned the pollutants like lead in gasoline or DDT, at least in this country. It doesn't work when we try to regulate it and say that you can only have so many parts per million, or you try to affect it with taxes, eco taxes, to disincentivize it. Some of this stuff has just got to be outright banned, and we got to replace it.
There's a thing called, the precautionary principle, which is something environmentalists have been pushing for quite a while now. But, basically should not be allowed to take action, businesses, unless you can prove that it's safe. And it really needs to be the responsibility of the government and those who want to do the action to prove it's safe, not, have consumers, prove it, unsafe. And one of the first things when I was working for Acorn, this mainly low-income Mexican-American neighborhood in the south part of Phoenix, surrounded on 3 sides by cotton fields, and the other border was the usually the dried out riverbed, except when it rained and all the roads washed out. But they was using this new chemical called Star, and women were miscarrying, animals were dying, and we made a big stink about it. Unfortunately, we had another neighborhood who was really rich, so you had this poor neighborhood and this rich neighborhood fighting together, and we kind of won in that they banned Star, which is the chemical that was causing the problem, but only in our neighborhoods. And they didn't change the process. And basically, these companies will come out every year with the new super pesticide to kill the boll weevils, whatever, without really doing adequate testing. And then once people would start complaining, oh, okay, that one's no good. Let's bring something else new. It's changing around the entire mindset. The other thing you mentioned about World War II, should have mentioned this earlier. We need one of the things that we started with Jill Stein 8 years ago. We had, I think, a little less active in your campaign, but the whole concept of a climate emergency, and that we have to act like we did after Pearl Harbor. We needed the government and society to mobilize all the resources and take control of factories and start building the solar panels and air heat pumps and stuff like that. Now, a lot of governments have passed climate emergency resolutions. I think it's now over 2,000. But the problem is it's turned into a public relations gimmick where they issue a resolution and the climate activists stand there and get their photo taken. Everybody's happy and smiling, but there's no teeth to it. And so you can go to climatepresident.org, and that lists dozens, if not 100, specific steps that President Biden, any president, could take without the need for additional congressional approval. It builds upon issues that the Congress has already sort of resolved. Because let's face it, our government has been gridlocked, really for decades, but certainly for the last 10 or 15 years. And it's really sad, for instance, that in certain ways our best environmental president, at least during his term, was Richard Nixon, who is no fan of the environment, but there was enough in environmental movement, 50 years ago that we could pass things like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And for decades, we've not really taken hardly any environmental action coming out of Congress. And when you and I grew up, Howie, we were sort of brainwashed in school that America's the best on environmental protection. That's not been the case for decades. We're way behind other countries, Europe, Japan, and other in terms of environmental protection, and which is also one of the reasons why it's been America that has driven global warming to begin with and allowing these fossil fuel companies to get away with things they knew 50 years ago. In fact, my mother, kept a publication from when I went to school at RPI because they did a story. This is 1972 about me and others starting a NIPERG chapter at RPI. And a couple of years ago, she, hey, here's your stuff in college. And I looked at it. So this is 1972. And there in that 1972 publication was a large scientific article about the dangers of climate change. And the even the scientists at Exxon and Shell went to the CEOs and said, "Hey, boss, got a little bad news here. We're burning up the planet, and we may, result in lots of cities being, overwhelmed with rising waters and rising temperatures. This would be a good moment to sort of diversify our energy business and get into, renewables because fossil fuels is not sustainable. We got to really get out of that." And, that's not what the CEOs did. And in fact, besides continuing to expand fossil fuel production, they basically lied to the public and paid scientists to spread false information, disinformation, and they're still doing it.
One of the things I wanted to comment on was uh, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey reintroduced their Green New Deal resolution, which is just a statement of sentiment, not a law that would actually do anything. But instead of touting the text, which I'm going to criticize in a minute because it hasn't changed, they just reintroduced it for the third session of Congress that they've introduced it to. They featured a Green New Deal for health, which is insulting because it's not about Medicare for all, a single payer health care, universal health care system. It's about investing some money in community health centers and making them greener in terms of their energy consumption and the materials they use, which is fine. But what happened to universal health care? And then when we go to the Green New Deal resolution, it's still got all the problems. Mark mentioned it's not opposed to new fossil fuel infrastructure or a ban on fracking, like the Greens' Green New Deal is. It's not about phasing out nuclear power, like the Greens' Green New Deal is. It's not about deep cuts in military spending to help pay for the Green New Deal, like the Green parties is. They extended the deadline 20 years to 2050, and to get to what they call net zero, not real zero. And net zero means we can burn fossil fuels and supposedly capture and sequester the carbon, which is a technology that hasn't worked, doesn't work, and is very expensive. And of course, solar and wind renewables are much cheaper. And then the whole thing is a neoliberal economic project. We were talking about an eco-socialist Green New Deal that relies on public enterprises and agencies and planning to coordinate the whole transition. What we're getting from things like the much touted Inflation Reduction Act, which I've been calling Build Back Badly, is basically private contracts for private corporations, which is not what we were talking about. We were talking about doing this through the public sector. And just to give an example of that, the original Green New Deal had a civilian conservation corps, and that was done through a public agency, and they coordinated the projects. They hired the people as public employees. The civilian climate corps that's proposed is privatized, and the money goes to the agency that gives out grants for the Domestic Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, and they're going to take in grants, and nonprofit groups are going to apply for the grants. So you get a whole layer of paperwork, not lack of coordination, and all through the private sector. It's just not doing the job. So, I'm just insulted by the most progressive thing we're getting from the two-party system on Earth Day. So,
Well,
I wanted to get that off my chest.
Well, you raise a couple of points that I wanted to quickly respond. In the new book, Putting Out the Planetary Fire, we have a chapter on what false climate solutions. It has nuclear in there. It has natural gas. Remember politicians like Mario Cuomo, probably Mario, but Andrew Cuomo in New York promoted natural gas as a bridge fuel to a clean energy future. In reality, natural gas was a gangplank to climate, collapse. But carbon capture and technology, one of the things people do not know is that the emission reduction goals that have been set by the IPCC, which I think they're now about 45 to 50% by 2030. They keep on changing a couple of percentage points. They admit that goal falls way, way short of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees centigrade. I almost never see the media make that point when they talk about what the IPC is talking about. And because the IPC, which is controlled by the fossil fuel petro states, and mainstream scientists, not cutting edge scientists. What they promote instead is what you just talked about, which is carbon capture technology, which of course the fossil fuel companies have promoted heavily because it allows them to continue to burn fossil fuels. The problem is after several decades, tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars of research in carbon capture technology and storage, it's not viable. And yet we're going to see this massive corporate greenwashing piggy bank. It's already being set up. to fund things like carbon capture, because the fossil fuel industry feels that they can, move their business in that direction. And the same thing with hydrogen. Hydrogen has a number of problems. Pink hydrogen, they want to use nuclear. Blue hydrogen, they want to use carbon fossil fuels. Green hydrogen, okay, in some limited circumstances, that's trying to use renewable electricity. But the utility companies, the gas companies, love hydrogen because they feel that they can take the existing gas pipeline infrastructure and put hydrogen in there rather than natural gas. They just see it as another way to continue, sort of business as usual. And so when this IRA, which is, I don't know, 1% of what we were talking about and maybe 10% of what even Biden was initially talking about, when this money, comes down to the local districts, every corporate lobbyist is going to have their hands out trying to grab a part of that money. And people need to be getting in there and making sure that money goes in the direction that we want. One good thing about the IRA was that it actually amended some of the previous so-called tax credits and subsidies for renewable energy so that it could be publicly owned. That had been a problem in prior tax credits, like one of the problems in New York State with some of the efforts that New York State was making to develop solar at schools, particularly with the federal tax credits available. You had to get a third party broker, a bank or some other financial institution, to be the middle person to, transact the money so they could take some tax write-off somehow and, collect their percentage as they pass the actual money on to the school to do it. So that particular log jam, has been eroded a bit. But this is going to be a lot of money. And if we think that we're going to solve the climate crisis by having hedge fund investors get rich off of building electric vehicles and air heat pumps, it ain't going to work.
Yeah, one thing about hydrogen, I just want to make sure people understand is they want to put hydrogen in these natural gas pipes, maybe to supplement the natural gas, or we should call it fossil gas. Um, so we keep to heat our homes and cook. We're burning uh, carbon fuels, whether it's hydrogen produced with fossil fuels or the gas itself. And this is a fight that we're going to have all over the country because, as Mark mentioned, that's the utility company's strategy to keep their pipeline infrastructure working and making money off it. And the alternative we want is electrification, heating and cooling our homes with heat pumps and stoves that are electric. They're very efficient, convection. I think they call them stoves, and that's where we want to be going. So this is going to be a big fight. And
Well, one thing I wanted to jump in, once again, Howie and I are going to age ourselves. When we were growing up, there was a famous movie called The Graduate, and it starred Dustin Hoffman, and we'll get the large plot line. But one of the key, sort of moments that went viral from the movie was, somebody at a party tells Dustin Hoffman, plastics, plastics. That's what you want to get into, for your future. Actually, my wife's trying to get Dustin to do a little PSA saying, no, no, no plastics. But if I was doing that today, I would tell people geothermal. I think geothermal is one of those industries that's really going to take off. It's taken off much more in Europe than it has in the United States, but it's beginning to take off. It's better. It's more efficient than air heat pumps. Air heat pumps, you kind of view them as being about 300 to 400% efficient. Not scientifically possible, but the way they work. Geothermal is even more efficient. And one of the things we've noticed in New York State, which didn't quite agree with, but actually the utility companies have moved into trying to grab a part of the geothermal business because you can do geothermal, what's called district heating. And so you do a geothermal system where you could do 50, 100, 200 homes at once, and you can basically use pipes, which utility companies are used to distribute that geothermal heat. Won't work in more spread out communities, but geothermal, once you have it in, the upfront costs are higher. It's very cheap to run, and it's very, very efficient.
Yeah, geothermal, as Mark's describing, is sometimes called ground source heat pumps because you get the heat from the ground, which is more efficient than doing it from the air. Although, on the other hand, bigger upfront costs, which is why we need an eco-socialist Green New Deal to have the public sector finance this. Because once you have your system installed, it's much cheaper to run than burning fossil fuels. So that enables you to pay it back over time. It's just you've got to have a public agency doing the upfront costs. It could be a public power utility, it could be a public bank or an agency, but that's what we should be doing instead of incentives. Like the Inflation Reduction Act has some incentives in there for doing those conversions. So you get a tax break or a subsidy, but it doesn't cover the whole cost. And it's the kind of thing, upper middle class people may be able to take advantage of, but not working class people. That's
Right.
why we need this through the public sector.
Well, I mean, also, I mean, one of the big fights right now in New York is, how much money, you know, even with the subsidy, will they give for people to put air heat pumps in? I did it in my house. Frankly, I didn't need it because I have a very energy efficient house, and I live in a forest, and we heat primarily with wood, which is sustainable at the level we were doing it. It cost me $15,000 to put in air heat pumps, and it's not going to make any money because my heating bills were so low. $5,000 rebate, so it came to about $11,000, dollars. I could do it. Low income, a lot of working families, they cannot afford it. And then the other issue, besides we need to be providing funds to make these things occur, is how do you raise it? And when we talked about the initial Green New Deal, we talked about cutting the military budget at least 50%, if not 75%, taxing the rich, but also making polluters, pay. And when we make the polluters pay, say we put a price on carbon, like a carbon tax, what politicians prefer instead is cap and trade, which even the Pope is condemned as being subject to speculation by Wall Street. The problem is you can see energy prices rise. And so you have to figure out, how do we rebate money to consumers so that they're financially held harmless uh, in transition. And of course, one of the things that the Greens have been calling for the last couple of years, besides the weapons manufacturers, the big victor in the Russian Ukraine conflict have been the fossil fuel companies, who have seen, because of the boycott and against the Russian gas in Europe, the prices of gas have gone skyrocketed, and these companies are making enormous record profits, much more than they've ever had before. And frankly, we should have recovered those record profits as excess profits and put the money back into the transition, to a clean energy future. They, in New York State, which I know the best, um, burning fossil fuels, increases public health care costs by about $30 billion a year. And, worldwide, 7, 8, 9 million people die each year from air pollution, mainly from the burning of fossil fuels. These people, of course, and when that, as I always say, that left wing think tank, the International Monetary Fund, they actually point out that, the world governments give about a 6 trillion, that's a T, trillion annual subsidy to fossil fuel companies. 75, 80% of that, according to the IMF, is because the governments do not charge the fossil fuel companies for the damages they cause by their business operations.
Yeah, bringing up the war brings up the question of international climate justice. And when Biden said preposterously, but he said it when he was pushing Build Back Badly, that he wanted to cut greenhouse gas emissions by the United States by 52% by 2030. And
Much
why?
faster than New York State is willing to do it, and New York State claims they're the best in the country.
Yeah, but Biden, I mean, 52% is too precise. He just pulled that number out of his bottom. And there's no way they're going to do it. But in that period, the environmental justice groups, a coalition of them, came out with a study saying we shouldn't reduce by 50%, we should reduce by 195%. And how do you reduce by 195%? What you do is pay climate reparations to countries in the global south so they can make the transition off of fossil fuels and into the 21st century solar age. Right. And that would require a global Green New Deal. And instead of doing that, we've got a global green fund, which is supposed to finance this stuff. And for 10 years, it's supposed to be funded, what is it, $10 billion a year? Or maybe it's $100 billion a year. It hasn't even got there.
Well, they did at the most recent COP in Egypt, nice authoritarian state to host it. They did come up with finance and loss as a concept. For some reason, Joe Biden was flabbergasted that the rest of the world gave a thumbs down to the IRA. That was not the world class, thing that was done. But we have not. The United States back. The United States has been the one most blocking reparations. But they agreed to think about it. So that in the world of politics, that's progress. But we should have talked a lot more, and I apologize for this, about the whole issue of environmental justice. That it is low-income people and communities of color that invariably is where these pollutant facilities are located. And that's not only true for the power plants and the air emissions, it's also very much true for plastics, particularly in Appalachia and Texas and Louisiana. And then, as you mentioned, the global south have been the recipient of the greenhouse gas emissions that the more industrial countries have done. And not only does the United States and Russia and some of the big countries need to reduce their emissions faster, but as you said, they need to do, reparations. And, we cannot lock poor people into the level of poverty that has been a result of their lack of economic development. We're going to have to um, lift up everybody. And when we talk about a just transition. The Greens have talked about actually guaranteeing, wages of people who, lose their job in the fossil fuel industry and making whole communities that have been dependent upon tax payments, from these fossil fuel companies. But we had to lift up, everybody. We're in this boat together.
So
we're almost out of time.
Yeah, we're coming up on our time. So, Mark, why don't you, give us your final thoughts and also tell people about the Green Party's EcoAction Committee and how they can participate, and plug your book.
Plug my book, Putting Out the Planetary Fiber. Available now at the biggest corporate bookstore on the planet. But you can go to gelfny.org, Green Education Legal Fund New York.org, and download it for free or just read it on the web. But if you want a paperback copy, you can get it. EcoAction Committee, we're part of the Green Party, gp.org/EcoAction/committee or something like that. I'm sure we'll post that someplace. We're doing Earth Day to May Day. Happy to come and speak via Zoom or stream host, whatever this is, about climate change. We're encouraging local green groups to set up their own state EcoAction committee to organize in your own state or your county or city or community and we'll be sharing, that information and, demand action from all levels of government, and then run for elective office yourself. If you don't win, you do educate them on issues, and so many issues that, AOC discovers the Green New Deal only 10 years after Howie, started working on it. Same-sex marriage, the Greens were way out in front in terms of, gay rights. And then the war on drugs, criminal justice reform. That's what the Greens do. It tries to get these issues into the discussion. And we have to make more connections with other movements. We're not going to win. We need a different world. We have to end capitalism. We have to build a world based on sustainability and the common good. Eco-socialism.
Thank you, Mark. And I would say, run as a Green Party member. Uh, one of the problems with these Democrats. Well, let me just say this: the Democrats took the Green New Deal. AOC. It really did come from the Green Party in New York, because AOC's campaign manager, when she was elected to Congress, had been the campaign manager of a Green candidate running for the New York City Council using New York Green Party's Green New Deal. So it was that close of a connection. It wasn't just she grabbed it out of the air; it was in the atmosphere. She got it right from us and then watered it down. Run as a Green, because we got to make the politicians come to us. Inside the Democratic Party, you can see it with AOC, they're captured. She said when she was supporting Bernie Sanders for president, if I was in any other country, I'd be in another political party from Joe Biden. But she's stuck with them, even though they have different politics. We need to speak our own politics independently to the people without adulteration. And even if we don't win, we can make the politicians come to us. Like I've mentioned this many times, 2014, I got 5% running against Andrew Cuomo. He wanted to run up the vote, get ready to run for president, get more than his daddy got, Mario Cuomo, and he got less. He got less than he got in 2010. And he looks over there, and what are the Greens talking about? Because he wants to compete for our votes. So we got a ban on fracking, a $15 minimum wage, paid family leave. So you don't have to win the office to make a difference.
And also, one of the things is, after your 5% of the vote, Cuomo began to have a series of meetings between his top staff at DEC and his own, basically, staff director and the Green Party to talk about the Green agenda. It only went on for about a year, but we had about 4 or 5 meetings. And one of the issues that the Greens educated Cuomo on was about offshore wind. And we have one of the best sites in the world right off of Long Island in New York City. And he turned to his DEC commissioner and said, "Is what the Greens saying accurate?" And the DEC commissioner said, "Yes." And when we got the new climate law passed in New York State, Cuomo actually came in with a stronger commitment for offshore wind than the mainstream climate coalition was pushing. They had told me, "Oh, those numbers are crazy." Fortunately, we convinced Governor Cuomo that they were not crazy, and now it's New York State policy.
Yeah, so don't let anybody tell you that, the Greens aren't making a difference. I want to give another example. Dave Dellinger wrote a book in the early 70s. Few people have read. You can probably still get it online. It's called More Power Than We Know. And he talked about the anti-Vietnam War movement and how we were so, getting demoralized, after the Tet Offensive, after the big moratorium march in 1969, the big student strike, basically a general strike of students in 1970, and the war was going on, and it looked like Nixon was escalating. And actually, Nixon ended up signing a treaty with the North Vietnamese to withdraw the troops. And by the end of, I think it was the end of 73, or maybe it was 75. In any case, we had won. And so Dave Dellinger said, we have more power than we knew. What we know now is even more power than that, because Nixon and Kissinger's secret plan to end the war, which they ran on in 68, was to threaten and maybe use tactical nuclear weapons against North Vietnam. And when they saw the big marches in 69, the moratorium marches on October 15th and November 15th. Millions of people in the street across the country. And they got scared. They said, geez, politically, we can't do that or we'll get thrown out of office. So that's all to say is, when you're out there and speaking up, you're changing minds and you're making a difference. So this is part of this. Today was, our contribution to this Earth Day to May Day period that the Greens often take action on. So today was Earth Day. Thank you, Mark, for being here. Sorry about the technical problems, but it'll be out there for people to see. And then next Saturday, April 29th, as we come upon May Day, we're going to have two very good labor organizers. Bill Berry, who's a Green in Maryland, longtime union organizer. He's just finishing another book on how to get your first contract. And Natalie Monarez, who is one of the leaders of the Amazon Labor Union at the Staten Island hub of Amazon. Also a stand-up comic on her, what she really wants to do. So they will be speaking on this podcast next Saturday. So I hope you'll be there for that. And happy Earth Day, and we'll see you next week.